Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. A good, tough topic today. Let's do it. What's the most up thing you've seen done by someone you know? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. My cousin killed all 3 of her children and stuffed them in bins in her storage unit. She's doing life in prison. Last fall, my tax preparer ghosted me. I thought it was strange, thought he died or something. New tax preparer asked if I had Googled him. I hadn't, and when I did, I found out he disappeared because he was convicted as a pedophile in my town. Dude was caught squatting in a home doing meth with a prostitute. When a bike cop caught him, he got his information and arrested him. He was released with a trial to be set. Problem is, dude didn't give his name. He gave my name and my mom's address. Dude was my little brother. That's not even the messed up part. My mom was getting notifications in the mail for my name to appear at court sent to her home. Then notifications for a warrant. She said nothing to me because, as she later explained after I was arrested at my work, I didn't think you would be in trouble. You know how many times your brother has been in prison? I just couldn't see that happen to him again. I told her that I requested the arresting officer to be at the trial and that I would be bringing a picture of my brother. She begged and pleaded with me not to do that. Fortunately, a friend of mine's represented me pro bono, so at least I had that going for me. My counsel asked to approach the bench before trial started and showed the judge the picture. The judge then asked the officer to approach, and all I heard was the cop point to me and say, "Yeah, that's not the guy." He pointed at the pic and said, "That's the guy." The judge just sighed heavily and said, "Case dismissed." And that was that. Years later, I was pulled over at a traffic stop. The officer ran my name, and it still came up that someone with warrants could be impersonating me. So I had to prove I was who I said I was by taking off my shirt in the cold to show I had no tattoos. Good times. My dad took me and my siblings to a water park once during our court-ordered visitation. We didn't get to go in the water park. We didn't even get to get out of the car. We got to watch other children on the other side of the fence play in the water through the car's windshield. Why? So that when we got home, we would beg our mom to take us. And we did beg, but she totally could not afford it. It never happened. But she sure felt bad not being able to take us. He also once brought us home from visitation with a baby chick for each of the 6 of us. A guy I used to work with randomly was at this restaurant, grabbed a steak knife, walked up behind a dude, grabbed him across the forehead, pulled his head back, and attempted to slit his throat. The guy grabbed the knife, and his neck suffered only a small cut, but his pinky got cut off and had to be reattached. To my knowledge, once he got arrested, he just never talked. I don't even know if he went to prison or a mental institution. So I've shared before my daughter passed away in 2020. I was a single mom and tried to start dating in 2022. Met a man in a child loss support group before I met my husband. We started dating for a few months, found out he never lost a child, and used it to pick up women. My mother-in-law lied to her now ex-husband about being on birth control so that she could get a second child, which he didn't want. It worked, and she conceived the last time they had sex. I have mixed feelings about it because that second baby grew up and became my wife, but it's still pretty bad. My mother-in-law signed full custody over to her husband and the abusive stepmother she'd called CPS on in the past. When my husband was removed, CPS called her and said, "We will send your son on a plane to you at our expense. What flight can you meet?" She said it wasn't her problem, since Dad had full custody and abandoned her son in the foster care system in another state for 5 years. But the most up part is how she insists she was a great mother. Left the bars drunk as hell. Hit a woman that was out on a jog. Left the woman to die in the road and drove home and parked their car in the garage. Their roommate saw the smashed to shit windshield and heard about the pedestrian on the news. Put two and two together. The person gets arrested while at work. Their parents were rich, influential people, so they barely served any time. My friend and my first girlfriend and I, 17 to 18 years old, hung around this lady and her husband, who were in their mid to late 30s. She had teenagers over at her house a lot because she was a street team manager for a popular local band, so they would come over to get merch, CDs, and just to hang out. She was giving and selling these kids weed, pills, and alcohol, and slept with a couple of them, including a threesome with her husband and a 16-year-old girl. She tried to pressure my first girlfriend and me to smoke weed and have sex in front of her so she could take pictures of it. We didn't. I'm glad my ex was more sensible than I was. I was gullible enough back then that I probably would have fallen prey to her. This is a trigger warning for the next video. It deals with some violence to an animal, specifically a hamster. So if that makes you uncomfortable, you can skip ahead about probably 45 seconds. That's really it as far as animals go in this video. So if you're worried about later on, it's really just horrible things done mostly to children, which some may say is worse. But have at it. Knew a girl who killed her hamster by throwing it as hard as she could against the wall multiple times a day until eventually she broke its neck. The following 2 months, she would periodically dig its body up to look at it. She was up on many different levels, but I ultimately stopped talking to her when she got married and wrote me a letter about how awful of a person I was because I expressed concern over her marrying a man she had known for 6 months. Said letter and said marriage were both sanctioned and orchestrated by our former pastor, whom I also do not talk to after he also sanctioned a marriage between a 17-year-old girl and her youth pastor. Ugh. Around 20 years ago, when I was a young teen, I started hanging around with a bad crowd. After a few weeks, they introduced me to this older nice guy who lived in a block of flats. He only let 2 of us in at a time and would give us booze, drugs, etc. I always thought it was weird and refused to take anything that he offered us. Because of this, he always said that he liked me for being smart. He taught us how to drive and got my mate to break into warehouses, etc. After a while, I thought it was too weird and I didn't like what my friends were doing. I told my parents and a few friends' parents what was going on, but nobody seemed bothered. Fast forward a few months after I stopped hanging out with them, my neighbor came to my house and said an older man was asking for me in a car. He ended up driving around my estate and spotted another mate from the same crowd. He ended up kidnapping him and selling him to a child prostitution ring in Manchester. He was AR'd for a few months. After he was released, he sued Manchester police and won. But he used that money on drugs, which ended up killing him. It always frightens me looking back. My cousin went to prison for doing something to his children. He only got 4 years because one of the kids didn't want to admit it. The police investigating didn't seize his laptop or anything, and my uncle had to keep it in storage. While in prison, he said other people in here did way worse than me. So why is everyone in the family treating me badly? And what I didn't that bad wasn't total lack of empathy or remorse. When he was being released, he tried to have himself released to my aunt and uncle's home, who refused. They had 9 grandkids, 2 of whom were not to be in contact with him at all. It took a lot of fighting to have this overturned. He ended up in a place about 20 minutes away. When he was being released, my uncle brought up the laptop. The policeman he'd been arguing with about the release address said, "You've had it in your possession, so if there's stuff on it, we can prosecute you." A new cop joined the conversation and collected the items for investigation. When he was released, he asked for his stuff back, focusing on the laptop, and lost it when it was found to be given to police. Now he cries on Twitter about being a father whose baby mama won't let him see his precious children and post photos with cryptic messages about being in the area. The two girls are doing well. I didn't know him personally and only learned this one recently from my mom. My parents grew up in a country ravaged by war. Many fled to neighboring countries. It was common for soldiers to target these fleeing refugees. One day, a group of young men, which included my dad and my paternal uncle, came upon a dead couple in the middle of the road. Their young baby was still alive and crying. My uncle was childless at the time and considered taking in the baby as his own. He went to go pick up the child, but realized that the child had pooped all over himself. He was angry that he'd gotten poop on his hand, so he flung the baby into the ditch and shot him. Well, karma must have caught up with him because he was shot when hunting in disputed territory a few years later. Grandma had a nurse who used to visit her a few hours every other day. The nurse pushed 90-year-old Gran off and she broke her arm, hip, and femur in the fall. The nurse stole all valuables in the house and left her to die. Mum noticed Gran wasn't answering the phone. Mum lives hours away. By the time Mum got to Gran, she'd been lying on the floor for over a day. The high school I went to had a lot of crazy things happen. I think the one done by someone I knew most out of all of them was a guy from my choir class who ended up bragging to a bunch of friends about how he, 18, got his 13-year-old cousin drunk and had S with her. When they rightfully threatened to report him to police, although they were also stupid kids who wanted to get him alone and beat him up before getting the cops on him, he sent them numerous death threats. The school police officer found him hiding from those students in one of the bathrooms, never saw him again, and never heard of what happened to him. But 3 years later, I'm sure he's not doing too great. Murdered his mom and attempted to murder his dad. Was only caught because his dad was somehow still alive and able to tell police it was his son that did it. He's currently serving life in prison with no chance of parole. He was one of my best friends at the time, and I never once suspected there was anything wrong or that he'd be capable of doing something like that. He was at my house, hanging out the night he did it, and he was so happy and cheerful the whole night. He laughed, and the next morning, I had police knocking on my door, asking if I'd seen him, and telling me what he did. It really does be the people you least expect. My neighbor, my parents, were very good friends with him, and he would babysit us after school while we were at work. He would have me and my little brother get naked and perform S acts with each other while he filmed on an old flip phone. I was 7, and my brother was maybe 5 at the time. He also had me wear lingerie and do poses or strip while he took photos and videos. He told us if we told anyone we'd get in trouble, so we never did. We did this multiple times. When I was in middle school, he was arrested for molesting his 5-year-old niece and having a collection of CP. I don't know what happened to him after that. I just remembered my parents asking if he ever did anything to us, and we both said no. There was a piece of land that's owned by my dad and an adjoining piece of land owned by the youngest brother back in my India, Dad's home country. Recently, there was a lot of government acquisition of land for highway projects. Since my dad no longer lived in India, it was the uncle that handled this plot of land for my dad. Now, this plot of land has been in possession for over 25 years, so my dad's pretty much forgotten about it. Another cousin, while visiting from India, alerted my dad, asking him whether we received the compensation for the land, and my dad responded saying that not really, otherwise my uncle would have mentioned it. Turns out, the dude kept the money to himself. It was about a cool $1 million. Loved how my dad handled it though. Not a word was exchanged between them. He just got a lawyer to sue the local authority for handing over money without proper verification. Pretty sure the officers were bribed. But we got the money back. Dad was devastated, but during our last visit, my uncle was seriously ill, and we thought we would lose him. My dad visited him, and he gave my father a long, tight, tearful hug that sort of meant more than an apology to my dad. Everything's forgiven, but not forgotten. Money. Man, that shit can really F things up. My brother's wife accused someone of R-ing her at 16 and ruined his life because of it. She's 22 now, and she told me that when she was drunk one night in full confidence. I was obviously worried, so I followed up with her the next morning and asked if it was true, and she admitted it. Then she said, "It's okay though, I've forgiven myself. Ugh, I was young and dumb." Obviously, I was amazed by that logic, and I explained to her that she did is really effed up, and then I asked if the guy had ever forgiven her, and after a full circle moment, she realized she never told the truth about it. This is by far the most sickening and dumb thing I've ever heard from another human being. My ex-wife left me penniless 8 days after I sold my company following a brain cancer diagnosis. Not only that, she abandoned and absconded with our daughter for a month, so I was fighting her in court and fighting for my life. I truly had nothing to live for, and shouldn't be here. I had sold my means of making a living. She took almost $500,000 in cash and emptied every account we had. However, this was 2014. She's gotten fat, has a fat-ass boyfriend, I'm still alive, remarried, and my daughter lives with me. Virginia law said I couldn't go after her for the money because it was a joint account and cash, much not claimed on taxes. Be careful who you count as dead. Sometimes we are too mean for the devil to take us. My mom showed up early in the morning at my house in the AM in tears because the guy she was seeing overdosed while they were using. In a panic, she left, stole his laptop and other items, and didn't report his OD. At that point, my mom had already burned all of our trust and lifelines, but that night I honestly have never felt any sort of familial relationship with her since, and every positive memory I had with her, which is very few, is overshadowed by that moment and others through her addiction. She was an addict, and I understand that, but I lived my entire life witnessing it, and although she got clean, it's still impossible to erase these memories. It sucks because I have no family for support of any kind, and haven't since I moved away when I was 16. I wish I knew what it was like just to call my parents during a rough day and ask them for advice, or someone to bail me out when I can't afford my rent, as opposed to me only getting messages asking for what little money I have. I'm barely hanging on, and no matter how fortunate I am to be in a decent home I can barely afford, with my girlfriend and 2 daughters, the kid in me wants so much to be able to know that the people who brought me into this world care about me. When I was 16, I was SA'd by my great uncle, my father's uncle, over a period of months while staying with him and his wife. When I finally got the courage to speak out, he admitted it in front of his wife, my father, and other professionals after I was removed from the house by Childline. My father stayed friends with him, went on camping trips, etc. POS died about 4 years ago, and after my father went to his funeral, I asked him why he stayed friends with him. His response was to ask me, "Why the f*** are you in my house?" Called me a f***ing bitch, made fun of my various psych diagnoses, and said there's nothing wrong with me. I just like the idea of taking meds. According to my family, I'm wrong for not wanting to speak to my parents. My mom was no better and blamed me for my stepfather SAing me, and saw no problem with the fact that he fed me my own vomit and gave me my first black eye at age 10 for undercooking meat, and just carried on from that day. I'm now 47 and still in therapy and on meds. When I was 7, one of my little sisters was dying of a rare form of meningitis. She was only 2 years old. My mother took a Polaroid of her in her hospital bed with tubes in her arms, etc. My mother carried that Polaroid with her everywhere and used it as currency to get free stuff instead of sitting with the little sister in the hospital. I remember the looks of disbelief from the adults she was scamming. It was like a mixture of cringe, horror, sadness, and disgust. But she got her way more often than not. For this, and many, many other awful things besides, my mother is going to hell when she dies, if she hasn't died already. This guy I went to high school with, but wasn't really friends with, ran in the same social circle as me after graduating. He was alright, but he had this older half-brother that always gave me a bad vibe. His stepbro was probably 4 years older than the majority of the group, but would always be at bonfires and parties with us. He seemed a little creepy, but mostly just awkward, and would do dumb shit like take his only vehicle mudding with us and smash it up, leaving him without a car. Nothing too crazy, just seemed like he didn't think shit through and was awkward with girls. Well, it turned out that he was a serial artist. He would drive to a local college campus neighborhood and find women alone at night and assault and R them. From the ones that came forward, or he got linked to, he did it at least half a dozen times. Girl walking home alone or parking their car at night, he would sneak up on them and assault them and R them. He climbed into a couple of victims' windows and used pepper spray on at least one victim. I don't know all the details, but it must have been going on for a year or two before he finally got caught. No one ever brings him up now, and his stepbrother and their family act like he never existed. My great uncle has dementia. His wife of at least 40 years, who has always seemed to be the sweetest lady, spent several years purposefully over-medicating him to the point he barely knew where he was most of the time. She then convinced him that they needed to sell everything and move to another state near his daughter so she could help his wife take care of him. So he sold his house and all his land that he inherited from his dad, all of his farming equipment, ATVs, all their furniture, everything. They moved near his daughter. Within a few months, his wife took pretty much all the money they'd made selling everything he owned and bailed. It didn't take long for him to drastically improve mentally, which was how everyone figured out she'd been mismanaging his meds. He hasn't heard from her in a few years, other than for her to get a lawyer to contact him about how she wants her half of his retirement and any other monetary assets he still has. Love it. My great-grandfather was a nice guy, like the kind that would help his neighbor with anything. If they asked for it, he also volunteered a lot. One day, he was at a soup kitchen at his local church with my great-grandmother. She got tired and wanted to go, but my great-grandfather stayed until the soup was gone, since he didn't want to waste it. On his way home, he walked past a house where a couple of rich kids were having a party or something. The kid whose father owned the house started yelling insults at my great-grandfather for some reason. He kept walking, since things like these don't bother him. This pissed off the little shit, so he threw a rock at him, hitting his back. My great-grandfather just turned around, thanked him, and continued to walk. That bastard went into the house, grabbed his father's rifle, and shot my great-grandfather in the back in broad daylight. Long story short, the kid got arrested, and my great-grandfather died about 5 hours later in the hospital. The kid got sentenced, and they thought they had the whole story behind them. Till about a year later, my great-grandmother was buying groceries when she bumped into that asshole. Somehow he managed to get out years earlier than what was announced in court. My great-grandmother was scared, especially since he looked at her with a shit-eating grin and made a beheading gesture with his hand. She left her groceries behind and left the store. That side of the family moved out of the country around 3 years later. We still, to this day, think corruption was involved. The guy would be around 55 to 65 now.